Many of the most common verbs in Spanish are irregular in the preterite tense. Luckily, though, even these irregular verbs tend to follow some patterns or have other things that make them kind of easy to remember. So in this video, we're going to take a look at a lot of those, and I'll give you some tips for keeping them straight and learning them. It will take some time. Be sure to take notes as appropriate as you go through the video, but with practice, you should get these down. We're going to start first with quite a few verbs that share the same set of irregular endings. So make sure that you get these down. Notice that we have no accent marks in these endings. That's part of what makes them irregular. Here's a list of verbs that use these endings: estar, tener, querer, venir, saber, poder, and poner. You may not know all of these, but you'll know a lot of them, and they're all fairly common, important verbs. However, we can't just cut off the AR, ER, or IR and add our new endings. Each of these actually undergoes a change in the stem of the verb that we need to also take a look at. Now, although I mentioned that these undergo a change in the stem, we can't confuse these with regular stem-changing verbs because there's a lot more irregular about them than that. So the same rules that applied to stem changers in the preterite do not apply to these verbs. But we do need to know that to use these verbs in the preterite tense, we're going to have to use these stems. So for instance, if we wanted to use the verb tener in the preterite tense, the first thing we would need to do, instead of cutting off the ER, is we would actually have to make this change and go with TUV as our stem. Then we would take the appropriate ending based on what we wanted to say, and we could add the rest of our sentence, whatever that may happen to be. So if you haven't already, make sure that you get each of these infinitives and their corresponding stems down in your notes, and that you make a note that each of these uses the same set of endings in the preterite tense. The verb hacer also uses these endings with the stem HIC, but there's one additional thing that we have to do with hacer, and let's look at it and talk about why. If we just followed the pattern that we had talked about, this is what we would end up with: hice, hiciste, hico, hicimos, hicistes, hicieron. And as I read through those, you might have noticed a problem. The problem was with hico. It doesn't sound like the rest of them. Sometimes in Spanish we'll see that in order to preserve a sound, in this case the s sound, we have to change the spelling. So here we change that C to a Z, and now it sounds the same as the others: hice, hiciste, hizo, hicimos, hicistes, hicieron. Two other verbs that use very similar endings are traer and decir. There's going to be one exception though. Instead of hieron as their ending, they use eron. So you'll have to write these down separately in your notes. Notice that these change their stem as well. So we have, for instance, traje, trajiste, trajo, or dije, dijiste, dijo, dijimos, dijistes, dijeron. Finally, let's take a look at what are probably the two most irregular verbs in Spanish: the verb ser, which you know means to be, and the verb ir, which you know means to go. Ser and ir, despite having different meanings, are completely identical to each other in the preterite tense. So I've put them on the same chart here. Take a minute, look at these, make sure that you copy them down correctly in your notes. Notice that there are, again, no accent marks here. Since the forms of ser and the forms of ir are identical to each other, it's important that we have a couple of tips to help us keep these straight. One tip is that we can use the context. Normally, if it's a form of ser, it wouldn't make sense to replace it with a form of ir. Keep in mind that ser means to be, so our preterite forms, think past tense in English, those would be like was and were. And ir, think past tense in English of to go, we're going to have went. So that's what we're looking at here. Let's look at an example. Antonio fue al parque. This sentence then, thinking about was and were as forms of ser and went as the form of ir, would either mean Antonio was the park, or it would mean Antonio went to the park. Logically, only one of those makes sense. The other way that we can tell is that we know forms of ir typically have the word a after them. In this case it's al, but it's still the word a. So that's an indication that it's ir. Therefore, Antonio fue al parque, either way we look at it, must mean Antonio went to the park.